Us now from Kabul is Omar Samad. He's an Afghan diplomat and the senior advisor to Afghanistan's chief executive officer, Abdullah. From New York, we're joined by Anand Gopal. He's one of the few Western journalists to have been embedded with the Taliban. From Shanghai, we're joined by Shao Yuqun. She's a senior fellow at the Shanghai Institute for International Studies. And right here in our Washington, D.C. studio is Andrew Small. He's a fellow with the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Ambassador Samad, let me start with you. We've just had a series of devastating attacks in Kabul, in Afghanistan, some of the worst attacks we've seen in years. The last one at the airport, killing up to 5 people. What does this tell us about security in the Afghan capital?
Well, the security situation obviously is not the way it should be. Unfortunately, it has deteriorated as a result of these very sophisticated, targeted attacks that have taken place over the last 48 hours, more or less. The last one being today near Kabul Airport, where at least 5 civilians were killed and many injured. So the government has decided over the last few hours to take stringent measures and also has basically warned the Taliban to cease from attacking civilians and targets within the city, and also given a lot of messages to Pakistan, because the government, both President Karzai, who had a press conference, and Chief Executive Abdullah, who spoke to the Council of Ministers this morning, said that Pakistan is where the Taliban are residing, and they need to do everything possible to stick to the pledges and promises that they made over the last few months to help Afghanistan and the region move toward peace.
You say the government is going to take stringent measures to counter the Taliban. Could you give us some idea of what these measures will be?
Well, there have been meetings of the National Security Council since yesterday, and I cannot go into details, unfortunately, but the measures will be to protect the civilians, to make sure that the security cordons around Kabul are strengthened, that we have better intelligence, and that we make sure that the terrorists do not enter the cities. We've also had issues just over the last few hours in Kunduz and in Helmand. So it's not just Kabul, it's a continuation of attacks we have seen for a while.
Anand Gopal, in New York, these attacks have come at a time when there have been signs of progress in the talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government. Now, you've spent time with the Taliban, you've got to know them. Why do you think these attacks have taken place at this time?
Well, I think the signs of progress that we've seen are mostly in the past now. With the death of Mullah Omar, there's divisions within the Taliban. And the Taliban leadership have said a number of times that they want to limit civilian casualties, but they clearly don't show that on the ground. This has been a record year for the number of civilians that have been killed, and almost every year that number gets worse. So there's real divisions within the movement. There's factions that are dead set against any sort of peace. There are factions that are very close to Pakistan, and civilians bear the brunt of all of that.
Yuqun, the Wall Street Journal reported in February that efforts by Beijing to enhance security in Afghanistan have been intensifying as the United States and its allies are leaving the country. So what role is Beijing playing right now in the security of Afghanistan?
I think Beijing thinks that the security situation is very critical right now in Afghanistan, and the stability and peace in that country is in the interest of China. So when Chinese President Xi Jinping attended the SCO summit in Russia recently, I think he announced that China would offer more security assistance to Afghanistan. That's what China can do currently. And I think China would cooperate more with the regional countries like Pakistan, India, and Central Asian countries, and of course the United States and NATO, and try to stabilize the security situation in Afghanistan.
Yuqun, when China says it wants to provide more security assistance to Afghanistan, what form does that assistance take?
I think China at the current stage would focus more on the material things rather than send troops to Afghanistan. And also China would offer some kind of a training program to Afghanistan, I think. That's what China can do at the current stage. And it would be not very sensitive to some regional countries. And it also is a kind of a proper program that China and the United States can do together.
Andrew, what is your view on these attacks? In a sense, is this some kind of negotiating tactic by the Taliban, proving that, look, we're still a force here to be reckoned with? They've just lost their leader, or they lost their leader some time ago. We just heard that they've lost their leader. It was announced just recently. But is this Taliban saying, you know, we're still powerful?
Well, I mean, in a sense, it's a new leader saying the Taliban are still powerful. There's certainly a degree of power consolidation taking place. As Anand mentioned, there are significant splits that have opened up in the movement since the confirmation of the death of Mullah Omar, and you have a new leader that is, his hold on power is actually somewhat fragile, it seems, at the moment within the movement. But this doesn't seem just like a gambit within the peace talks at all. There's not the sense that this is a prelude to immediate return to talks. I think at the moment the focus for the Taliban leadership is all very heavily internal.
So we're seeing fractures now in the Taliban under this new leadership?
In the process, actually, of the peace talks, I think that even the confirmation of the death of Mullah Omar itself was a byproduct of some of the pressures that had come about as a result of the move into peace talks, about which there was not a full degree of agreement within the Taliban.
Ambassador Samad, what do you make of the timing of the announcement of Mullah Omar's death? We understand he died 2 years ago. Why announce it now?
I think the view in Kabul is that this was done on purpose, of course. Who did it is not very clear, but since he lived in Pakistan, even though the Taliban say that he was in Afghanistan, but there's no shred of evidence whatsoever that he was in Afghanistan or he died in Afghanistan. But since he was in Pakistan, so we think that the Pakistanis knew about it. And maybe one or two Taliban, as we know, maybe his successor may have known to what extent they were involved in the post-Mullah Omar activities. Obviously, his name was used up to just a few days ago. He kept sending messages from the grave, and he kept encouraging his troops to continue with their activities. But having said this, what is important is that they're now going through some transition, and the transition is not an easy one. There's probably infighting, and there's obviously a concerted effort to bring them under one umbrella and the one leadership. How that leadership will look like at the end of the day, we don't know. And so the peace talks that had started, nascent peace talks, are now on hold, and we don't know how long this will remain as such.
Anand, we're hearing now in the Taliban, as we just heard the ambassador say, that it's going through a period of transition. There are changes, there's infighting. Do you think this is going to lead to a change in tactics?
This is probably not going to lead to a change in tactics, and I think the attacks we saw in Kabul this week are evidence of that. The new leader wants to consolidate his base and project his jihadist bona fides, and so I expect we'll see more gruesome attacks like this. However, we perhaps we'll see a difference in strategy in the medium and long term, because there are different factions that are emerging along a number of lines, one of which is how closely these groups believe, or how much these groups believe that peace is possible. That's one sort of fault line. And another fault line is the question of Pakistan. There are some elements within the Taliban who are looking to get out from under the thumb of Pakistan, such as by moving to the Gulf and having operations run from there. And there are other elements of the Taliban who are very comfortable in Pakistan. And so these are these different fault lines, and I think down the line we'll see sort of the real differences come out of this.
Yuqun, when we look at China's role in trying to resolve this conflict, is China seen as a bit more of an even-handed broker in trying to bring these two sides to peace? Does Beijing have the ear of both sides?
I think Beijing's approach would be Beijing plays a role like a facilitator of the peace talk. Beijing would say that the policy of the Chinese government is that the peace talk should be led by the Afghan government. It should be led by the Afghan people. So all the other players like Pakistan, the United States, and China would be the outside factors, all those facilitators. So the Afghan people should decide the process of the peace talks. So that's what Beijing is doing now. And right now, I think Beijing is watching at the both parties of the talks. For the Afghan government, I think the task is very challenging because the government should first of all show its capability of it can deal with the Taliban, and it can maintain the governance of successful governance of the country. It can stabilize the security situation in that country. That would bring the Taliban back to the table to the peace talk with the government. And on the Taliban side, I think right now the situation is very complicated because within the group there are several factions and they have different approaches toward the peace talk. Some of them, they are against the peace talk. So what the outside players and the Afghan government can give them incentives to let them come back to the peace talk table, that's very important. So I think Beijing should work with Pakistan, with the United States, with India, and with all the regional players. And among them, the most important is the Afghan government. And let's see what we can do together to bring the peace talk back to the trial.
Right, Andrew, when Ashraf Ghani became the new leader in Afghanistan, the first foreign country he visited was China. What is the relationship between President Ghani and President Xi Jinping?
Well, President Ghani has made a sort of China play since he came to power. I think a lot of the value in the relationship, there are investments and things that are hoped for from China, but a lot of the value really comes from the relationship between China and Pakistan. So Ashraf Ghani's sort of play since he came in with this early visit and in the last period of time has clearly been to encourage China to play a much more active role in the process and to play a more active role in pushing Pakistan to support peace talks and ultimately to put pressure on the Taliban. I think there were questions until quite recently as to whether this strategy was really paying off, and I think the peace talks themselves were seen as a sort of successful product of this process. And there is no doubt at all, in my mind at least, that China has been putting pressure on the Pakistanis to bring the Taliban to the table for these peace talks as well. So in a certain sense, or whether this strategy can be seen to be working right now, I think the China play in broad terms has been relatively effective so far.